I'm Leon, I'm 25. I live in Bridport, but I've grown up in or around Dorset. I play bass guitar, not often enough, I don't practice enough, but I like writing poetry, video games, movies. So I started using ketamine about just over three or 4 years ago, maybe. I was already heavily in addiction for other substances. So I was at university when I first sort of came across it. Initially I didn't, get involved, but, later down the line, yeah, it was through other people at uni, and it's very big. There's a few different sort of dangerous or unexpected situations that have, cropped up due to my ketamine use. I decided to mix it with LSD, which was a very, very bad decision. It was a bad trip and a bad K-hole together. In my head I was being, flung around by my ankle through like a black hole, just completely traumatic experience. And then in reality in the room, I was spinning around in circles, throwing up all over my living room, and then passed out, and then had to go to work the next morning, still feeling the effects. And, I've also been, sexually assaulted while on ketamine, while being almost sort of paralyzed and not mentally there. And that's a very common experience with it, because, as a tranquilizer, you're very powerless, very vulnerable when on it. It's very unpredictable. You never really know how it's going to turn out. My experience was, it's like sort of the walls were closing in, whatever room I was in was like a small sort of claustrophobic box. The walls would shift. It made me very paranoid. I'd be confused about what was going on. Any noises I'd be very suspicious of. I had a sense that there was danger around me, even if there wasn't. Yeah, it was quite a scary place to be in. I very quickly had sort of a physical dependence on it. I'd get withdrawals, sweating, shaking, headaches. It's also, I'd get nosebleeds. It's quite harsh on your nostrils. It's very sharp. It's like glass. It sort of cuts as it's going in. I was lucky enough to not have the sort of bladder and other organ problems, but I've known loads of people who have had really serious health problems from especially ketamine, and very quickly. People, 22, 23, and already having, kidney, bladder problems. With my drug use, I think, early on I considered it recreational, but my progression was very rapid into it not being recreational and it being a problem. And I was, I knew this deep down, but the way, the nature of denial is that, it's insipid, it's very cunning. You invent excuses, ways to justify it, and I would tell myself that, it wasn't a problem, it was just recreational, or I was just treating myself, and then next week I'd go easier or whatever. But it was never the case. Basically, after the first time I used ketamine, I was immediately, and this applies to, most drugs I've taken, I was buying it secretly, I was doing it secretly on my own in my room, all day, every day. Just, that's all I cared about, all I could think about. Addiction was very was very painful, very relentless. Not only is there the aspect of isolation, of disconnect from others, but it determined every decision I made. And I would not make good decisions or decisions that I considered were, in my character or aligned with my morals. And it wasn't something I could have control over or power over. I couldn't moderate it. I felt, powerless and defeated. But I also didn't want to stop because of my past, because of my mental illness. My experience before drug addiction wasn't positive either, and I didn't want to go back to that. It didn't occur to me that I could actually progress forward and live a positive life. In hindsight, I wish I knew how addictive ketamine was and how badly it would combine with other substances, for sure. Because I was told by someone because some people, somehow, it's an alien concept to me, but some people can use or will use drugs recreationally and then stop. And I was told by, one of those people that it wasn't addictive in their opinion. And so I had nothing to worry about, but that very much wasn't the case. It's very addictive, it's very widespread. Ketamine, the way it impacted my life was, it doesn't really, it doesn't make you particularly productive or, good at relationships, social or romantic, or, family. It's, you're cutting yourself off, you're removing yourself from reality. You're not present. And it made me more isolated, it made me more secretive, it made me more sneaky, it made me more disconnected. I was completely, financially destitute, and I stopped caring about, my university course altogether. I wasn't going to lectures. I eventually dropped out. I'd completely run out of money. I couldn't pay my rent. I was suicidal. I had no desire to live whatsoever. And, it's a big cause of relationship breakdowns. I've struggled with mental illness, as far as I can remember, really. I was diagnosed anxiety and depression as a teenager and eating disorder later on. I found that sort of mentally, emotionally, ketamine was a way of, me escaping reality, sort of numbing myself. But it didn't work in quite the way as, I'd imagined. Time would sort of skip. You'd have a KO and dissociate or whatever, and you'd realize time had passed and you hadn't been present or experienced it really. And in that sense, you almost feel like you haven't properly enjoyed it, which makes you just want to take more and feel whatever it is you want to feel more. And it never felt like enough. It never satisfied whatever urge I had. I felt desperate and, just not wanting to be in reality at all. And I'd go to lengths. I'd use all the money I didn't have to get it. But, since stopping, I don't have that worry. I don't have that emotional distress, that constant thinking about it, planning, stressing about how I'm going to get more, how I'm going to function. I don't, show up to work with, still on the effects of it. I'm able to function and have sort of, mental clarity and be present. I'd say that I identify as neurodivergent. I've sought diagnoses for autism and ADHD. I very much identify with, you know, those characteristics, those traits, those symptoms. And I think that there is a huge overlap with neurodivergence and ketamine and other substance use. Things are a lot more, in general, the world seems more stressful and hostile and alienating, and substances like ketamine seem like a good way to alleviate that in the short term. I found my recovery through 12-step support groups, and that was the best decision I've made. For me, it's been Narcotics Anonymous, and you know, that's completely changed my life. That's been what's kept me clean and has given me, you know, a reason to want to live, a strive to live, and to, you know, work on myself and to connect with others and, you know, be a part of society. My life now in recovery is, you know, it's beyond anything I could have imagined, really. You know, I'm not a millionaire. I'm not, you know, I don't have a car. I don't, you know, I don't have a crazy, extravagant life, but I have, you know, everything I need. I'm stable. I've got a roof over my head. I don't have to lie and steal, and that obsession and that compulsion is lifted from me. I'm not every waking second craving, needing drugs, worrying about how I'm going to finance drugs or hide, you know, the condition I'm in. A lot of friends had cut me off, or I'd distanced from them as a result of my using. And since then I've, you know, made amends, and I've, you know, reformed close friendships, and they're stronger than they ever were. And I'm able to communicate better and accept support more. All the things I do I could have never done while using. You know, I'm on the road, I have a license, I can work, I can volunteer stably, I can be trusted. There's a lot more opportunities for me now that I'm clean, and opportunities I'm willing to take or I'm willing to notice. I'm able to have a better perspective, be more open-minded and accepting of things. I'm no longer fighting against, you know, the world. I'm no longer fighting against existence, against reality. Yeah, I feel safer. I joined Clarity earlier this year. It was, I was given the details by someone I know also in recovery, and it basically sounded ideal, the exact kind of thing I wanted to do. You know, I wanted to get into helping people in addiction, recovering from addiction, and I loved the sound of the sort of, you know, personal touch, the lived experience side of it, focusing on stigma, things like that, just struck a chord with me, and I was been very enthusiastic about being a part of it. If you are using ketamine, I'd say be careful. Don't combine it with other substances. It gets very messy. You know, it's very unpredictable. And you know, stay hydrated, and stay in a safe area. Try to do it around other people. Don't, you know, don't lock yourself in your room and do it alone, because if something does go wrong, you know, you won't be safe. And the more you do it alone, the more you do it in secret, you know, the bigger a problem it becomes, the worse your self-esteem becomes.